want to now pivot to discussing the next topic for us, which is the transformation now of the military doctrine. So for those of you who have an understanding, there has been a transformation over time over which kind of military doctrine rules. We know we had Bush Doctrine, Powell Doctrine. We've had various doctrines throughout times, the Clinton Doctrine. Now we are beginning to see not only the Donroe Doctrine, but a much larger Trump Doctrine, a Trump Doctrine of a way of doing things. Also, I want us to get into that, and I want us to really understand and unpack that. That's really important for us. Of course, we have the Epstein Doctrine, everyone knows, and the Bibi Doctrine, the Satan Doctrine, as many are saying in the chat. True enough. Let's take a look. First and foremost, I want us to go back in time because history is important. And do we remember this person? Anyone in the chat know who this is? I'm interested. How many remember this person? I remember them. I was young, but I remember them. And I remember later on what they ended up doing. Anyone in the chat want to throw out? There we go. Colin Powell. So this is Colin Powell when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he was really the major architect of what became then the Powell Doctrine. And the Powell Doctrine is built upon a previous level of military knowledge and understanding about conducting war. And what I'd like to do now is we're going to get into some articles that have come out recently and to kind of take a look at it. But before we do, let's look at what the Powell Doctrine spoke about in terms of armed conflict, and now what the transformations are in American foreign policy and American military doctrine that are happening right now. So let's take a look. Let's go to, so this is from the Atlantic Council, which is basically a NATO think tank for all intents and purposes. So this is from 2021. The Powell Doctrine's wisdom must live on. So that's when Colin Powell died. So let's take a look at the Powell Doctrine. So in here, the author writes, in its simplest formulation, the Powell Doctrine is a set of criteria governing the use of force abroad. Eurasia Group President Ian Bremmer, in his book Superpower, 3 Choices for America's Role in the World, summarized the doctrine as 8 key questions. Number 1, is a vital national security interest threatened? Number 2, do we have a clear and attainable objective? Number 3, have the risks and costs been fully and frankly analyzed? Number 4, have all other nonviolent policy means been fully exhausted? Number 5, is there a plausible exit strategy to avoid endless entanglement? Number 6, have the consequences of U.S. action been fully considered? Number 7, is the action supported by the American people? And number 8, do we have genuine, broad international support? I think that many now would look at this and say, I think we're missing a lot of those in this case. So as many of you are noting in the chat, we have a lot of holes in this. So the Powell Doctrine would not agree with the strategy of the Trump administration now. They would have done it a different way. I'm not saying that they wouldn't have attacked under the Powell Doctrine, but they would have done it a different way. You have, for example, number 7, is the action supported by the American people? Clearly not. The overwhelming majority of Americans, at least in a majority, do not agree with what is happening. Is it a vital national security? Is a vital national security interest threatened? If you're thinking about Israel as a national security interest, then yes, but no, not for the United States. There was no U.S. national security interest that was threatened. Number 2, do we have a clear and attainable objective? Clearly not. We have no objective that has been laid out. There's been nothing that has been clearly laid out for us to understand what the objective is. First, it was Iranian ballistic missiles, the Iranian nuclear program, but they said they already destroyed the nuclear program in the 12-day war last year. So what actually is the objective. First, it was the nuclear, then it was the ballistic missiles, then it was the proxies. Now it's full-on regime change. They've killed the supreme leader. We just elected the next supreme leader, which is Ayatollah Khamenei's son, Mojtaba Khamenei. So that, and he's even a little bit more conservative and more, according to the Western press, radical. So they didn't change much of anything. And I think that there is still no clear objective. Do they want a government to remain that's clerical, not Islamic Republic, full regime change, balkanization? Nobody knows what's going on. The third one, have the risks and costs been fully and frankly analyzed? Clearly not, because as I mentioned last night, the national security report that was prepared by these security experts, these intelligence experts, clearly said that there was no way forward for regime change, and that regime change would be extremely costly. So clearly, number three, they didn't expect that it would go this way and that the Strait of Hormuz would be closed and there'd be attacks on oil infrastructure. And we're seeing closure of Dubai airport and tourism and travel. I mean, we have a lot. We have a lot that has not fully been flushed out. Have all other nonviolent policy means been fully exhausted? Clearly not. They attacked in the middle of negotiations. There was supposed to be a technical group a week after, and they attacked in the middle of negotiations. Is there plausible exit strategy to avoid endless entanglement? Clearly not. This is about to turn into an endless entanglement. Unless the U.S. goes with its tail between its leg and fully retreats, clearly we are in an endless war scenario now. And that's a major, major problem for everyone. Have the consequences of U.S. action been fully considered? I don't think so, because they've opened Pandora's box, and now how to put all of that back in is not possible now. They've completely changed the Middle East, whether they wanted to or not, in their own myopic vision. They have changed it, and they've unleashed forces that now they cannot control. Is the action supported? Like we said, no. And do we have genuine broad international support? Clearly not. Everybody in the international community is mostly against what's happening. So I just want people to understand that we are in a situation where we really don't have a clear understanding, a clear plan forward, and a general idea of how this is in any way in the interest of the American people, America first. This is clearly Israel first. And of course, the chaos in the region helps Israel because it wants its own project, Greater Israel, Third Temple, its own messianic designs. And some of the Christian Zionists want that as well. They're all waiting for the Messiah or Armageddon or a combination of the two. Let's go now, and I want to show you how this is shaping up. Let's go now to look at what is happening in the foreign policy establishment. So we have this article coming out, Trump's Way of War. And this is why already people are declaring the end of the Powell Doctrine. So this is from Richard Fontaine, who's the CEO of the Center for New American Security. He worked in the Department of State, National Security Council, and was foreign policy advisor to U.S. Senator John McCain. So you know that he comes from like an older, mainstream, mainline foreign policy establishment, but neocon establishment. But in any case, Trump's way of doing war is not their way of doing war. And they might be happy, but clearly some of them are not happy because it's not going the way that they wanted it to go. Now, foreign affairs is considered to be the mouthpiece, so to speak, of a lot of the foreign policy establishment. If you don't read it, I would suggest that you do read it, not because you agree with it, but because you understand the mentality. That's why I subscribe to it and I read it, because I'm able to look at what do the foreign policy experts, analysts, and career diplomats think about foreign policy and foreign affairs. How are they thinking about it? How are they constructing these various narratives? And I think that once you understand those, you can unpack them. So it's very, very important to have an opportunity to do that. And I hope and encourage you all to do that. So let's go in and let's take a quick read at this. I think it's very good. So Iran, Venezuela, and the end of the Powell Doctrine. When bombs began falling on Iran this weekend, most Americans were as surprised as the rest of the world. The U.S. force posture in the Middle East had been building in the preceding weeks, but negotiations between Washington and Tehran were still underway. Even as the US military readied for an attack, the Trump administration obscured the exact objective. There was remarkably little national debate, scant discussion with US allies, and no vote in Congress about the desirability of conflict. 2 days into the war, administration officials have yet to articulate a specific vision for how it will end. Instead of employing decisive force, US President Donald Trump is prioritizing flexibility. This stance reflects a new way of war, visible across multiple Trump interventions from the Red Sea to Venezuela, that inverts traditional thinking on the use of force. Indeed, in many ways, Trump's use of force is the anti-Powell Doctrine. Developed during the Gulf War, 1990 to 1991, by General Colin Powell, who later served as Secretary of State, the Powell Doctrine held that force should be employed only as a last resort, after all nonviolent means have been exhausted. If war is necessary, however, it should proceed in pursuit of a clear objective, with a clear exit strategy and with public support. It should employ overwhelming, decisive force to defeat the enemy using every resource, military, economic, political, social, available. Derived from the lessons of Vietnam, of which, by the way, Colin Powell was a Vietnam veteran, the approach was designed to avoid protracted conflicts, high death tolls, financial losses, and domestic divisions. As Powell later wrote, military leaders could not quietly acquiesce in half-hearted warfare for half-baked reasons that the American people could not understand or support. So clearly you're seeing now some differences and separations that are emerging between the Powell Doctrine that came before President Trump and now this developing, we could call it a Trump Doctrine. Powell's approach, which built on criteria established by Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger in the 1980s, spurred debate from the start. Some critics thought the all-or-nothing approach to war would preclude the tailored use of force to achieve modest but still important goals. For supporters of the doctrine, that was precisely the point, and they saw continued interventions, such as those undertaken by the Clinton administration in Somalia, Haiti, and the former Yugoslavia, as a misuse of military power that risked failure or quagmire. The U.S. invasions of Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003 were key tests of the approach. The George W. Bush administration sought to apply the Powell Doctrine in both cases. It declared war only after the Taliban and Iraqi leaders, respectively, ignored U.S. demands and after the president spent considerable political capital to persuade Americans that the decisions to go to war were wise. The administration's stated objectives were clear: to eliminate the safe haven the Afghan government was providing al-Qaeda and to rid Iraq of weapons of mass destruction, respectively. Now, we all know in this stream, we all know, for everybody who's watching, that's absolute bullshit. So the weapons of mass destruction was completely fabricated. The author still believes that this was somehow a justification. But as we know, we knew then, by the way, and we know now conclusively, there were no weapons of mass destruction at that time. The weapons of mass destruction that were given to Iraq were provided to Iraq by the Western powers during the war against Iran in 1980 to 1988. And they were used on the battlefield, of which people like Professor Morandi were subject to not one, but multiple chemical attacks. So everybody should understand that. And that's something, that's why when you're reading this stuff, you're thinking in your mind, okay, I understand where the author is coming from. I understand their biases. I understand their point of views, and I can critically dissect what I think is absolute horseshit. And of course, that was no objective that was clear. It was a false objective, and that should have been rules and grounds for not doing it. But of course, they manufactured consent for it. Continuing on, it also sought and received congressional authorization in both cases. That's true. In Afghanistan, U.S. forces combined a lean on the ground presence with withering air attacks and support for fighters in the Northern Alliance, which entered Kabul and overthrew the Taliban. In Iraq, 160,000 U.S. troops launched a ground invasion to topple the regime. In both instances, the planned exit strategy was to turn governing institutions over to exiles, local leaders, and domestic security forces, after which American troops would come home. Now, if we pause here, how did that go for the Western Alliance? Clearly, it did. The U.S. was thinking to itself, we can turn over governing institutions to exiles, local leaders, and domestic security forces, while at the same time in Iraq carrying out de-Baathification, completely creating a sectarian environment that didn't allow for the unity of the country. And in Afghanistan, they started a process of nation building, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, but in Afghanistan even more. They started a process of nation building that was absolutely creating a dual power and a dual structure of society. So Kabul started to look more Western, but the rest of the country, especially the provincial areas and the more rural areas, did not see any of that major impact. In fact, over time, the US military lost further and further control of the periphery. In a classic sort of guerrilla tactic, the Taliban started to take territory slowly from the periphery and started to conduct, you could even say, a Maoist type form of guerrilla warfare to take first the countryside. And after the countryside was taken slowly, it started to make major advances into the cities and the urban areas. And you saw very rapidly that the whole country fell as a result. So this is also an extremely, I would say it's overall, it's a piss poor strategy, but it's absolutely evil strategy to somehow take over a country and remake it in your image when the people do not support you in any way and the people have no say in this. So that's very important to recognize here. So continuing on, things clearly did not go according to plan in either case. We know, we lived through it. Attempting to avoid prolonged conflicts brought them about anyway. The wars proved extraordinarily costly and deeply divisive, and their objectives seemed only to shift over time. Whether the intervention's problems came from a misapplication of the Powell Doctrine or from the misconception of the approach itself, the dark shadows of Afghanistan and Iraq have colored every U.S. military intervention of the past 2 decades, including the war now underway in Iran. In an effort to avoid repeating such debacles, the Trump administration has pursued something like their inverse. And while the Trump Doctrine comes with serious challenges, it has also produced unexpected results, and it is likely here to stay. So clearly, the Trump administration wants greater latitude. It wants to have more flexibility on all warfighting and on all objectives. And that provides it the opportunity to not take a position and then be held accountable for that position, but to kind of waffle and go back and forth, up and down, and play this kind of 4, 5, 6D chess and try to constantly move the goalposts with the media and with the American public about what the objectives are, what's being accomplished, what needs to be committed, how much of the cost has to be borne by the American people and by overall the military that's now undertaking this effort that has been launched. So this new approach to war began forming in Trump's first term and has solidified in his second. In 2017 and 2018, Trump ordered missile strikes against Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria and continued U.S. military operations in Iraq and Syria against the Islamic State, also known as ISIS, including the raid that killed ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. In 2020, U.S. forces killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. Last year, Trump launched a war against the Houthis in Yemen, destroyed key Iranian nuclear sites, and attacked militants in northern Nigeria. This year, his administration invaded Venezuela to seize its president, Nicolas Maduro, and just 2 days ago launched a major operation in Iran. By the way, I was in Yemen, in Sana'a, in the capital, as the U.S. was bombing it. We went to bomb sites. There was a bomb. I was with Jackson and our crew. There was a bomb that exploded just streets away, and it shook everything. And it was, you could hear the whizzing as it came down and the impact. We went to impact sites. We saw them destroy a cancer hospital so much. We went there. You could still smell the bomb. You could still smell the kind of chemical cocktail from the propellant and the explosives that were used. It was horrible. It was horrible to see. And we were able to identify pieces and fragments of the bomb, and they were clearly U.S. made. So that's something that is very, very much part of this story, that we're living it right now. We're living this current transformation in military doctrine. And some of us, especially in our community, have experienced it firsthand. Those operations' departures from more traditional ways of employing force are striking. The Powell Doctrine, for its part, holds that war should be a last resort, turned to only after political, diplomatic, and economic means have failed to attain the desired objective. In 1990, President George H.W. Bush gave Saddam Hussein a deadline for withdrawing his forces from Kuwait, and a decade later, President George W. Bush gave both Saddam and the Taliban public ultimatums before beginning hostilities. That's nothing new because Trump also gave a public ultimatum. He said, basically, don't do nuclear anymore. Give up your missiles. Give up support of the proxies, and we won't conduct military action. Right. So those ultimatums always exist, more or less. But now, even within negotiations, they're launching attacks. So it's not even that they're waiting for the ultimatum to take hold. They're just launching attacks, and there you go, take it. Trump's approach, on the other hand, has been to use ambiguity as a source of advantage to catch his opponents off guard. The 2025 and 2026 U.S. attacks on Iran, for instance, took place as negotiations were ongoing. His administration issued no public ultimatums to Soleimani or Maduro. For Trump, it seems, force is not something to employ only when all other means have been exhausted, but rather one of several tools available to increase leverage, maximize surprise, and produce outcomes. Now, of course, you all will know that these outcomes are short-term. They're not necessarily long-term outcomes. These are short-term outcomes that don't necessarily provide long-term benefits. They do provide short-term chaos, which is, I think, beneficial for some people and some groups, but it does not provide for long-term stability, prosperity, and peace in any of the regions where they are conducting this. And you've seen that this force has been utilized to basically take state hostage. So we have, for example, President Maduro and his wife, Celia, in prison in New York, and simultaneously, we have basically the Venezuelan government hostage to whatever the U.S. government wants. The Venezuelans have not really reacted in a public way against the U.S. by actually trying to push it out. They've acquiesced to a lot of the demands of the U.S., even though some have been vocal. There's nothing more that they're willing to do at this point, at least at the governmental level. Another element of the Powell Doctrine that Trump seems to have done away with is the emphasis on public support. And that's what we're talking about here, right? The Powell Doctrine treats the Vietnam-era protests against American intervention as the paradigmatic case to be avoided. If some objective is important enough for Americans to fight for, the thinking went, then the people in whose name the fighting takes place had better support it. Establishing such support generally requires the president to make a case frequently and over the course of months. Congress is expected to demonstrate its own approval through a vote to authorize force after extended debate. So we know, many of us know, the Vietnam protests were an axial moment in American history. They transformed the political scene. They transformed the war itself. It led to the end of the war. And it changed, I think, a lot of the cultural history from then on. That's where we get movies like Rambo and sort of the disgruntled soldiers that aren't respected by American society anymore, and that have been betrayed by their own government, right? That's a key thing. They not only have lost the support of the American people. The American people are free to choose. They were betrayed by their own government. That's the even bigger part. So that's something to consider at this point. So that's something very interesting for us to understand, that public support no longer factors in. The Iraq War demonstrations, of which I participated in, the anti-Iraq War demonstrations, there were millions of people on the streets. New York, London, Chicago, Seattle, LA, all over the world. South Africa, you name it, everywhere. There were public demonstrations against the war, the buildup to the war in Iraq. That didn't affect the war. There have been demonstrations ever since in every other intervention, and nothing has been able to stop these wars. In fact, the opposite. They've gotten more violent, more unpredictable, and more unknown as to when they would start, just like this recent war that was launched 9 days ago. So that's a big problem. And I think this is going to eat into a lot of the American, not only support, but trust in governmental institutions. We already have an erosion of trust in governmental institutions. We have an erosion of trust because of the endless wars, the regime change operations that have gone on, COVID-19, the pandemic, there's been a major erosion of trust. And now we have an erosion of trust that has taken place because of this belligerent foreign policy. And I think that that's really important to hone in on, because I think that's going to have lasting impacts in American political life. But not a single conflict during Trump's presidencies has been preceded by a campaign to win public support, and Congress has not voted to authorize any of them. Instead, each conflict began suddenly and followed an unpredictable course. Rather than lay out a case for each war, the president often insisted he hoped to avoid it. His administration put a priority on surprise, attesting, for example, that the Caribbean military buildup was to stop drug boats, not to prepare for a direct regime change operation in Venezuela. Congress was largely sidelined. Iran today presents an even more ambitious regime change operation, but in last week's nearly 2-hour State of the Union address, Trump talked about it in only a few sentences. The scale and stakes of the war make the administration's seeming disregard for public debate all the more remarkable. And I think that that's why you have major outcry by Massey, by, as dear brother Nathaniel says in the chat, by former veterans, by former military personnel like Brian McGuinness and many others who are going out there and saying, excuse me, what is this? We didn't sign up for this. This isn't our country. We don't recognize our country doing this. No more wars for Israel. America first. You said prioritizing America. Why are we going on this next adventure? And they are very angry about it. We have Massey upset about it. Tucker Carlson, Candace is speaking out against it. Of course, in politics, we have many on both aisles, although a minority on the Republican side, that are against this. And we even see former Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene basically coming out against this fully and saying she doesn't even recognize the administration at this point and their policies. So this is very serious. What we are seeing here is very, very serious. And I think that this erosion of public support, but also the erosion of including the Congress and pursuing sort of this idea, which has been really a part of the Trump administration, but other presidencies as well. I would say Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump, these presidencies have really increased. And actually, you could go back to Dick Cheney and President Bush Jr., right? President George W. Bush. If you go back and you look at the idea of a more concentrated executive, a more powerful executive branch, they find their roots in some of the neocons, especially in Dick Cheney, who wanted to see this idea of an imperial presidency, of a presidency that could do military action without getting Congress's approval. And we'll come to that in a second. I'm going to talk about the laws of war and about the Constitution and the declaration of war. We'll get to the laws of war on a separate topic later on tonight. So this is very important for us to look at. The Trump administration has also avoided articulating clear objectives for its use of force. When announcing that war with Iran had begun, the president said that the objective was, and I quote, to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime, even though Tehran was neither enriching uranium nor in possession of missiles capable of reaching the United States. A day into the attacks, Trump wrote on social media that bombing was aimed at achieving, and I quote, our objective of peace throughout the Middle East and indeed the world. He has said both that the goal is regime change in Iran and that he is planning to negotiate with the leadership that replaces the supreme leader. Trump similarly said at first that pressure on Venezuela was necessary to stop drugs and gang members from entering the United States, before later explaining that the goal was to bring Maduro to justice, that he wished to take back oil stolen from the United States, and that the operation was consistent with the new corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. What precisely Americans are fighting for in each country and how they will know whether they attain that end remains unclear. Where the Powell Doctrine calls for clarity, Trump instead prizes flexibility. By claiming multiple and often vague objectives, the president retains the ability to stop the fighting without admitting defeat. This, rather than obvious victory, is his exit strategy. When announcing attacks on the Houthis, Trump said, "We will use overwhelming lethal force until we have achieved our objective. with the objective allegedly being to end Houthi attacks on American vessels in the Red Sea. The Houthis, Trump later said, would be completely annihilated. A month into an expensive and only partially successful bombing campaign, however, the administration cut a deal with the group to end its attacks. Finally, Powell's dictum holds that the United States should employ overwhelming, decisive force in pursuit of its objective, defeating the enemy as swiftly and soundly as possible. Trump's approach, on the other hand, favors short, sharp military actions that employ only particular kinds of force, especially air power and special forces, almost always excluding conventional ground forces. If the price of regime change in Iran is the large-scale deployment of ground forces, Trump has made clear that through past action that the United States will not pay it. It will instead settle for less. With the possible exception of its attacks on ISIS, the Trump administration's wars have largely employed limited rather than decisive force. In 2017, the United States launched strikes in Syria in response to Assad's use of chemical weapons against Syrian civilians. We know, of course, that that was fake, but they're saying here as if it was true. But Assad's leadership remained secure, and he used chemical weapons again in 2018, also false. In 2025, Trump boasted about obliterating Iran's nuclear sites, but in 2026, he cited the danger of Tehran acquiring a nuclear weapon as a casus belli, which is basically a cause for war. Maduro is now gone from Venezuela, but his regime remains in place. That is, PSUV, the Socialist Party of Venezuela, remains still in power under Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president under Maduro. In all of these cases, flexibility rather than decisiveness is the watchword, allowing Trump to settle for outcomes that were never clearly defined at the outset. And that is what I'm talking about in terms of moving the goalposts. Also, it's a bit like Trump is running war and American foreign policy as if it's social media. You move the goalposts, you switch the narrative, you can go back and forth, and there's actually nothing stable, nothing long-term, nothing impactful. It's all short-term, quick. There you go. I can make a meme. I can make a story. I can make a quick propaganda pick or clip or whatever. And that's what's necessary. That's what's to be achieved. And that sadly is not the best way to do foreign policy for any major country, especially a nuclear power. So now we're getting towards the conclusion. Good enough. In some ways, the Trump response to the Powell Doctrine has served recent history better than a dogmatic application of the original. Following the limited use of force against the Houthis with a bilateral agreement produced a better outcome than ignoring the attacks on U.S. shipping. It was also better than using pure military force, as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates had attempted for years. Likewise, the world is better off without Iran's nuclear sites at Fordo and Natanz, and without Soleimani running the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The jury remains out on Venezuela, but it is still possible that a democratic transition occurs and that the country avoids a descent into domestic chaos. Short, sharp uses of force that preserve flexibility in decision-making, leverage ambiguity and surprise, minimize the chances of quagmire, and end with a good enough outcome might be the best approach in many cases. So the author now is starting to see some positives in Trump's way of doing things versus the Powell Doctrine. They are likely not the best approach to all cases, however, and the limits of Trump's way of war may soon be clear. The attack on Iran represents the most ambitious of Trump's foreign policy gambits to date. Forcing regime change in a country that is much larger and more populous than Iraq or Afghanistan through an operation with no ground component and no obvious domestic allies, and in the face of an entrenched security apparatus, will be extraordinarily difficult. The range of nightmare scenarios from an IRGC-led military dictatorship to a descent into domestic chaos is wider than the happy possibility of a democratic uprising. And that's true. We've seen nothing that in any way indicates that there's going to be a successful regime change at this point. In fact, the Council of Experts has picked already the new supreme leader, and they're moving ahead with consolidating the power and whatever vacuum, which really there hasn't been any, that was left after the martyrdom of Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei. Here, the president's flexibility and ambiguity might show the way forward. If the United States and Israel are unsuccessful in toppling the Islamic Republic of Iran, if U.S. forces take significant casualties, if the American public grows tired of the conflict, or if the alternative to continued regime change rule looks even worse, Trump could stop the fight. By claiming that the objective was, from the beginning, to simply weaken Iran and to ensure that it does not obtain a nuclear weapon, the president could and likely would declare victory. In so doing, the president would upend one last Powell maxim, the Pottery Barn rule. Before the invasion of Iraq, the general cautioned, "You break it, you own it." In an effort to break the Iranian regime, Trump has already telegraphed that the United States will not own the aftermath. Should it collapse, the Iranian people will need to pick up the pieces. If it endures, Washington will wrap up the fight and move on to other priorities. Such a scenario would demonstrate one more limitation of the Trump approach. However, it does not pave the way for long-term peace, but postpones conflict to another day. So there we have this very interesting article, and I thought it provided a great opportunity to really get in the mind of some of the foreign policy establishment and what they're thinking at this point. And that's very important for us to recognize and to understand, to unpack. So this was a great way to kind of look at the Powell Doctrine and then its antithesis in the developing, we can say, Trump Doctrine.